Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk ETC. I have Steve Shelton. He's a developer with CrossVault, and we are going to have a discussion today about some recent debates that have happened in the Ethereum Classic community. As you know, there is always a struggle to try to increase the scaling of ETC and actually any blockchain system with public blockchain system without hampering decentralization. And so there's an ongoing debate right now. There was a proposal about decreasing the maximum gas for ETC blocks. And so and Steve had an opinion about that. And we welcome discussion, different ideas, and we want to air them out so that the right conclusions are reached. So that's the reason that I invited Steve on the show. So welcome, Steve.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. So before we begin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got interested in blockchain technology, and then ETC. I know you from your post, right? You had thought about a lot of these technical issues that I just introduced. So you certainly have a lot of technical knowledge. So why don't you fill us in on your background?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in the financial industry for most of my career. I worked with JP Chase. I worked with a couple of smaller financial services company. As you mentioned before, I'm with CrossVault right now. CrossVault is a company that really is trying to fix that whole everybody jump in the blockchain pool and throw money at it and then have no idea what they're doing. So what we try to do is create products that align with our clients' interests. And essentially, you can think of us as reselling blockchain space. We have a customer, they say, I want to do this. And we try to find the appropriate technology for what they're doing. And a couple of years ago, that was Ethereum. Ethereum was the place to go. I taught myself Solidity from the ground up. I've been working with it for about a year and a half, to the point where I probably couldn't tell you what C does anymore. Solidity. And as a result, I've had some firsthand experience on what it requires in actuality to have a mission critical application running on the blockchain versus a toy. And that's, I think, where we're running into a difference of opinion. If you're doing a toy application, any size is good enough. And it doesn't matter if it takes one confirmation or half an hour or an hour for your transaction to go through. So it doesn't matter if gas prices are jumping all over. And what we've done in reality, what we found in reality is that, yeah, it matters a lot, to the point where we've actually had some successful products launch on testnets like Rinkeby simply because that's reliable. We can get the transaction in a block or two on Rinkeby, but you run the risk on any testnet that resource will go away and you'll lose literally all of your data at the whim of a developer. So we really want to work mostly with blockchains that are serious about not changing and having that blockchain be an immutable asset.
So wait. So you're saying you fielded an application on test nets, and you verified that they work correctly, and so now you're at the point of moving a big application to the public blockchain. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, that's a part of any development lifecycle. I can't talk about the projects we've actually completed because I'm under NDA. But we do have some projects that are in life cycle right now that are up on the various test nets, seeing how they function and how they perform and whatnot. But I can tell you right now that these things will immediately fall apart if it takes 7, 8, 20 confirmations for a transaction to go through, or if we have things not happening at all for 1, 2, or 3 days, simply because the price of gas is running 50 gig away, and our transactions were priced at 1 or 2 gig away, and they simply don't go. But the important thing actually has to do with the immutability of the blockchain. And I'm finding clients that basically I want a uncontestable record. I want something so that once it's there, it's there. And that's what is, I think, the shining thing with Ethereum Classic. I mean, Ethereum Classic forked because people felt fundamentally that, that code was law and that the blockchain must be immutable. And Vitalik had a disagreement with the community over that. So, you end up with a blockchain that was changed specifically to fix the whims and needs of an application that never should have seen the light of day without, undergoing further code review and further development. And we don't want to be in a situation where we've got a client and we're explaining, hey, yeah, sorry about that, but this one app that had $100 million thrown at it, well, they didn't check their code thoroughly, and because of that, you've lost 5 days of data.
Okay, so you and your customers appreciate the value of immutability that ETC brings to the table.
I really do now. I've actually had a change of opinion in the past 6 months. I was literally out there screaming from the rooftops that, what happened with the DAO is theft, and that there's doing whatever we need to do to make the customers whole is the right thing. And people who are viewing blockchain immutability and code as law don't know what they're talking about. And now here I am 2 years later, and I've got egg on my face.
Okay. Yeah.
I was wrong about that, because once I actually saw a client who lost a couple of days of data to a blockchain reshuffling, different blockchain, I realized that, I have an obligation to my clients to ensure data and integrity at all stages.
Are you able to share which blockchain had that reshuffling?
Well, let me tell you that it was a blockchain that was attacked with a greater than 51% attack. And thankfully, it was only test data, but we were testing on a live network. We had gone from development of an application to, we'd run it on a normal test net, and it was no problem. And then we put it on live. And a couple of days later, they had a big attack where they had a 51% attack. And, it wasn't an Ethereum derived chain.
Okay.
And this was more or less that's what I'm looking for. This was more or less a notary type of application. So not exactly a toy, but the information being stored on the blockchain was more along the lines of, verify that this existed types of stuff.
Right. So 51% attacks, while Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Ethereum Classic are likely well protected, some of the smaller blockchain systems are vulnerable. And so you just shared a real life example where that was a real problem. Yeah. All right. So let me elaborate for the audience on what brought us together specifically. So Pascal created an Ethereum Classic improvement proposal, ECIP-1047, and he was suggesting that miners voluntarily set their software to decrease the maximum block size. So right now it's roughly at 8 million gas units, and he was suggesting decreasing it to 1 million gas units. And one of the reasons was to make it easier in the future for people to sync the ETC blockchain. And so there was some pushback to that. And so that's what started this, our discussion. And so if I'm not mistaken, Steve, you think that it's not a good idea to decrease the maximum block gas that is allowed. So do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. Not only do I think it's not a good idea, I think it's on par with, let's suicide the chain as far as being bad ideas go. I totally respect Pyskill. Do not read me wrong in this. The man has earned his rights and his opinions, and I do see where he's coming from. I can understand that, slowing it down, being unable to validate on an older machine or with a slower internet connection, it does go against some of the ethos of the ETC community, which has always been about decentralization.
Right.
But on the other hand, most people, like 90% of people, do not sit and run a fully validating node. You spin up Parity, you spin up Geth, and unless you turn on full validation, you're not validating this stuff. So it's a moot point. And there's also the question of what is the point of validating, of running your own validations, if the network at large is disagreeing with you? And so really then it comes down to centralization of mining in and of itself. And the only way to ensure that mining remains decentralized is to change the consensus protocol. And that's going to go over like a lead balloon. So really then, what is the purpose of lowering this gas block limit? Yeah, you need less CPU cycles. You're wasting less CPU cycles because you're not getting anything if you're just validating the blocks that are already there. You're not getting any of that gas. What that really represents is a count of the CPU cycles that you're going to need in order to verify that the miner didn't get it wrong. But if it's 500, 10,000 blocks in, it doesn't matter. You're not rejecting that block. The network's already accepted it.
Okay. You've said a lot of stuff. Let me just make sure I'm keeping up with you. So first of all, I liked what you said about this is nothing against Pyskill. These are difficult-ish, complex issues, and so we're just having an open, respectful discussion about this issue. So that, and Pyskill's done some great work for the community. So I'm glad we threw that out there. So you're saying that the concern about the amount of time it takes to validate the entire blockchain is not as big of a deal as one might think, because very few people validate it to begin with. We all, like we were saying before the show, that when I install Parity gives me the current state of the system, and I'm trusting it for convenience. And so you really have to go the extra mile to set up your client to truly validate every block in the blockchain. So that's your first point, that validation is not that important as people think. Is that correct?
It's not important while we're this decentralized. It becomes important in the future as we centralize. And like I've said before, centralization is it's a built-in feature of any coin that has some sort of network subsidy. If there's profit to be made, then that's going to consolidate with economies of scale. And so you have fewer actors, and so you have fewer places you can download your blocks from in general, right? Mm-hmm. So you then have to trust those producers to be producing blocks correctly. And you can't just simply say, I'm not going to accept your block because it's invalid, if the rest of the network is in disagreement with you. So these are finer points of consensus, right? Right. The situation we have right now is not like it is in Bitcoin land. In Bitcoin land, there's like 4 players, right? There's 4 major players in the Bitcoin space as far as mining goes. 3 of those are owned in whole or in part by the Chinese government. So if China wanted to shut Bitcoin down, it would take 3 phone calls from one person, and Bitcoin would lose 3/4 of its minting of its mining capacity instantly, right? Right. But the opposite of that is also true. If China said to those 3 companies, "Here's a transaction. This is the Satoshi hoard, and we're going to give it to the Communist Party." Those 3 miners could collectively say, this is a valid transaction. the rest of the network would follow on because the rest of the network can't just simply diverge on that. That's the bulk of the mining capacity. That's already 51% attack, right?
Right. Okay. So if I understand you correctly, ETC is not as centralized as Bitcoin is currently. So we don't have to be as paranoid about validating everything because our protection is in the greater decentralization of the ETC network. So if somebody tries to lie to you and give you an incorrect version of the chain, somebody else is quickly going to dispute that, and that issue is going to get resolved.
Yeah, I mean that's the way the consensus works.
So then, what you're saying then is it's important to keep the mining process decentralized, and you mentioned that the way to do that, whenever you have a profit motive, which is inclining miners towards centralization, is to change the consensus algorithm. Now, do you have any thoughts on, because I'm not aware of a perfect consensus algorithm that
there is no perfect consensus.
Right. So I don't know if there's any obvious improvements that proof of work can accept that would help with, I mean, there might be minor ones, but did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, here's the deal. The solution while we're on proof of work is to maximize the opportunities for miners to make money other than the block reward. So while the block reward amounts to the network paying a subsidy to the miner, right? The gas limit amounts to the total amount of fees that the miner can collect. So if you reduce the maximum gas that's allowed in a block, you're saying to the miner, we want you to favor the network reward or the network subsidy over the fees that the users are paying you in order to run these computations. As long as the miner is able to run those computations in the allotted 15 seconds for a block, right? Mm-hmm. The miner is able to make money. If the miner isn't able to make as much money, he's going to want to join with other miners. This is where pooling comes from. This is where the whole concept of a pool originates, is the miners aren't making enough money individually. They can make more money as a collective. But if you can make more money as an individual, why would you share that?
Now, to be fair, I don't think pooling necessarily, there's a tiny fee, but I think the reason people pool, or miners pool their resources, is just to even out the reward, so it's not so feast and famine all the time.
Oh, yeah, exactly. But, and here's the big but, it really does come down to the nature of the computations being run. Now, in Bitcoin land, you've only got the one computation. Everybody search for the magic ticket. That's what you've got. But in Ethereum land, you've got how many transactions can I fit in this block to maximize my personal reward, right? So the more computations you can stuff in a single block as a miner, the better off you are. And the less you need a pool, because it's not so feast and famine. Your reward per block is just so much greater than your reward from sharing the network subsidy with other miners.
Right. Now, I see what you're saying. You're saying that by keeping the gas maximum large, it will disincentivize pooling. Now, I see your point, but I think miners, because it doesn't cost that much, they'll probably still pool their resources anyway. However, let me just encapsulate where I think we're at so far. So Pascal is saying that if we lower the block gas maximum, that will that'll encourage decentralization. But you're saying that if we have a large gas maximum, that in itself will encourage decentralization by the fact that it'll attract more miners. Did I get that right?
Correct. Yes. So here's PySkill's logic, and then I'll contrast with my logic, and we could both be right, because in the short term he's actually right, but in the long term I'm actually right, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. PySkill's logic is if we reduce the block, if we reduce the maximum gas per block, then we won't end up with mega blocks that take longer than the block time to validate for your average home computer, right?
Right.
If you're always running a deficit and you can't validate the blockchain, you're not going to validate the blockchain. And if you're not validating the blockchain, you're not likely downloading all the blocks anyways. So the blocks themselves are just not available. So like when I was trying to sync, my computer spent its first 12 hours searching for somebody that had the entire blockchain. I was connecting to this node and then this node and then this node, and no one had the blocks I was looking for. So it couldn't sync.
Okay.
And part of that is, yes, people don't want to sit around with 100 gigs of blockchain data that's really not doing anything. There's no reward for serving that up. And that's just a thing that's in the Ethereum design, and it was copied over into the Ethereum Classic design. I've got some ideas on how we could fix that part of it.
Okay.
But he's right. If the blocks tend towards being smaller, then they're more likely to be available because they're occupying less space. And the other thing is if they're smaller, more miners might join up simply because there might be more work and because the price of gas will go up, right? If there's less real estate in each block, then I'm going to have to bid more as a company, as a user of the blockchain, in order to ensure that my stuff gets through, because the number of gas units is not something that I can control. Once I deploy my smart contract, the number of gas units that every transaction is going to be used is relatively fixed, or at least it is if I've done my job right. And I can get into some interesting stuff there. But, the minimum is, I believe, 2,300 gas just to send money from Ethereum from me to you with no contracts involved. Right. But I've got contracts. We had on Ethereum a lottery type of contract. It was actually, what was it? It was more like a raffle, right? Where you could actually win this other coins. And part of the distribution and everything else, it was costing us 300,000 gas per drawing. Well, that's not a problem at 1 gigaweek. But when you're talking 100 gigaweek, you're talking $100 for 300,000 gas per drawing, and the company's only making $2 for every one of these drawings. So it cuts into profits and it makes Ethereum less useful. But that's
okay. So if I'm tracking you, so the counter argument to what I just previously said, where a big gas limit will attract miners. The counter argument to that was that if you had a small gas limit, the price of gas would go up, and that might attract miners just as much, if not more so. But you're making the point that making gas more expensive is a problem for businesses that want to have a lot of transactions on the blockchain.
Precisely. And perhaps even more importantly, it's not just the price. It's the volatility in the price, right? If there's ample room, then there's no need to say, I'll pay you 20 gigaweek now and 100 gigaweek later and a 10 gigaweek here. But it makes it very hard to budget. And when you're sitting with a spreadsheet and you're trying to calculate the costs of moving a piece of infrastructure that cannot fail, right? Mm-hmm. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to calculate at the biggest it's ever been in order to even have an estimate, right?
A worst case scenario?
Right, a worst case scenario, and budget in at that. And when you start budgeting these things in at the worst case instead of the average case scenario, well, then blockchain technology in general looks a lot less attractive. I mean, seriously, why would I pay 1/4 of a cent per transaction when Oracle, with licensing fees included, is only running me an eighth of a cent or a tenth of a cent.
Right.
And what I tell clients is, no. Don't look at it as a penny per transaction, right? Because you're looking at this as a per transactional cost. But once something is on the blockchain, it's there forever. It can't be tampered with, right? So what you're really paying for here is the immutability aspects. However, when you have something that has to go through, let's say Johnny is at McDonald's, he's buying a hamburger with our cool new cash coin, right? And the company that we're working with right now is actually a credit card processor. So I guess this might be why my mind is on this. And they're looking for a settlement mechanism between other processors and for individual users. And they want a settlement mechanism that can happen in 60 seconds or less, and where they can still profit with their swipe fees, which run about a 0.5%. And they need to be able to generate a profit on this. But they also want to retire a huge amount of hardware. And in order to do that, I mean, they're going to save, when they do this, they're going to save millions of dollars a year on Oracle licensing fees, on SAP, on processing hardware, on data center fees. So we can sell that to them, but then we have to tell them, but your variable costs are very much variable. They could go from, a hundredth of a cent 1 minute to $5 the next minute. And $5 on a 50-cent transaction is not worth their while.
Right. Can I ask you? Okay. Can I ask you? I just had an idea for you. Can I ask you? All right. So that's a valid point that we want to have scalability in our blockchain architectures. We want to be able to do a lot of transactions. Of course, the dream in Bitcoin land is to compete with credit cards, and they're nowhere near the scalability necessary to do that. However, I have a completely different suggestion for you. And I don't want to tell you or your customers how to run their business, but what about this idea? So one way that people are trying to attack the scalability problem is with sidechains, right? Permissioned blockchains, et cetera, that periodically write to a public blockchain. And so you've probably heard of Lightning Network. So the idea is you, off of the main chain, you get all the scalability, the speed, the low cost that you want, and you just periodically write to the immutable ledger, the main chain, and that might be one way to have everything you want. What about that idea?
I'd be lying if I said we didn't evaluate that. But one of the reasons that we're looking at getting at even though we're testing on Ethereum, of actually backporting to Ethereum Classic, is because we do feel like the sidechain idea, the Lightning style idea, is a bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is because you're increasing centralization again. But now, instead of centralizing around miners who have a profit motive, you're forced to deal with the node that opened that payment channel for you. And you don't know who that node is. That might be someone who can veto your transactions, and it might be somebody who's reliable, but it could also be some 15-year-old kid in his basement who's sharing his internet connection with his sister running 4K Netflix. You can't rely on that.
Right. Right. Again, and I'm not an expert on sidechains, but what if you had a federation of people that you trusted that ran, let's say we're me and you were going to start a credit card competitor. And so we have to temporarily trust this consortium. But then because they write to the main chain every hour or whatever, we'd only have to trust them for a very short period of time. See that?
But you don't just have to trust them for a very short period of time. The problem is once you bake that in, you have to always trust them. And what happens if they go belly up? That's the problem. Right.
I mean, and the devil's in the details, but are we sure that this sidechain idea, there isn't a way to somehow write to the mainnet fast enough to have scalability and immutability and low price?
I'm not at all saying that there's not, and I can't comment too much on some stuff I've got in the works. But side chains are an important thing. They have to be done properly. They can be a big benefit, and if you do it right, there are no centralized nodes that you have to deal with. The payment channel itself becomes a part of the blockchain, and the people that are processing it, you can pass it to any node, and they'll write into it, and then there's state maintained in what amounts to an in-memory database in all the nodes that are working for you under some contract, right?
Right.
And that's actually part of a design of something else that I'm working on, but it's not really relevant to our block gas size debate, because at some point this crap needs to get put into the blockchain, right? And all you're really doing by side channeling it is delaying when it gets wrote, right? It might be with side channels and lightning type chains that all this intermediary stuff doesn't need to get wrote, and eventually you have one single big friggin' transaction that gets wrote to the blockchain. And that's important for something like Bitcoin, which literally has a 1 megabyte limit still to this day. You only want the big guys transacting actual Bitcoin. And then the little guys can transact what amount to a fork of Bitcoin, little lightning coins that are transmitting back and forth that represent some Bitcoin in some big whale's wallet.
Right.
Now,
I see what you're saying. You're concerned that side chains, all they're doing is delaying the writing of all that information to the blockchain. But let me throw out another idea, and I know this because I've had the Stampery startup on my show, and they basically have a notary service on the blockchain. So you know what a hash is, of course, and you can hash any amount of information and it'll be the same size. So the reason I threw that out there is your side chain could, let's say, process 1,000 transactions. And then to have immutability, you hash all those thousands of transactions, and then you just put that one hash on the main chain. See what I'm saying? So that you're not going to have to write all the information in explicit detail in order to get security and immutability.
Right.
So go ahead.
I'm really not arguing that, but again, it comes down to how do you validate that what they did was correct, right? If it's on a side chain, you need access to that data if you're going to do the validation. And here's where Cykill and I are differing on opinion, because side chains aren't what's being discussed and are not really relevant to this ECIP.
Right.
What is relevant is what is the maximum amount of data that we can fit in a block and still have your average home user be able to, in real time, validate the transactions that are coming across. Because, that does, to some extent, increase, or I should say decrease centralization or increase decentralization, right?
Right.
Either way, same thing, right? And what I'm saying is that if you want home users to be using Ethereum Classic, you need to have killer apps, and not just one. You can't just have a CryptoKitties, right? Mm-hmm. But you also can't have those killer apps choking up everything and driving up the costs for any business that would want to use the blockchain as it's designed, God's own blockchain, for lack of a better term. So if the maximum amount of gas in a block is too small, that deters users. And some of those users are businesses that are looking at your blockchain and saying, well, for the amount of data that I'm trying to store, I can't store it in a single block with this chain, but I can go over here and I can store it over here. And they're both running the same basic programming language. I can have my app ported to there, and to them, it's not really relevant whether it's Ethereum or Ethereum Classic. What really matters is dollar cost per transaction, and if that dollar cost per transaction can remain steady. If they have to enter into a competitive bidding environment in order to ensure that their transaction goes through, they're just generally not going to do it. I mean, why? Really? I mean,
Right.
Why not just spin up spot nodes on AWS and store your stuff in a MySQL store or something like that?
Right. So no, you're making the very valid point that to attract applications to ETC, we want to keep the gas price low.
Right.
Okay, so that's a valid point, and the concern is that ECIP-1047 will lead to increases in the gas price, which would decrease the chances of the killer apps showing up in large numbers on ETC. Is that correct?
That is very close. It's not just an increase to the gas price. If it were just a flat increase to the gas price, I mean, if miners just said, I'm not going to accept any transaction unless it's at 1 gigaway, that wouldn't be a problem.
The fluctuation is the problem.
The problem would be if we're going from 1 gigaway to 100 gigaway to 20 gigaway, and we cannot anymore project what our costs are going to be.
Okay.
If you're a company, cost variability is a huge concern. If you're running 10,000 transactions a day, your average cost becomes very important. And if 6 hours during the day, the blockchain is congested and you're having to pay 100 gigaway, and then the other 18 hours in the day you're only having to pay 1 gigaway, you're going to want to structure your app so that it's not doing anything during those 6 hours, right? Right. So that leads to complexity, not only in design and requirements, but in cost control techniques and a whole lot of other stuff. And the important thing isn't price so much as pricing variability.
Yes. Okay. Yes. That's what I picked up on. Yes, I see what you're saying. Okay. Now I haven't followed Bitcoin's price that closely, but just out of curiosity, is the price of Bitcoin, does it make microtransactions pretty much not possible now unless you're moving a large amount of value? Do you know?
Well, let me tell you this. Since the Bitcoin Cash fork, we've not messed with it. As far as telling clients, use this as really anything, either a canonical data store or a KV store or anything like that. We just don't recommend that people use Bitcoin for this kind of purpose. For a simple KV store, the null data space is only 32 bytes. So even if you're using like Bitcoin Cash, you're not doing a lot. I mean, about the most you can reliably use Bitcoin Cash for is if you're taking an SHA-256 hash of something and trying to prove that it exists. So you were mentioning before your, what was it? I forgot what they're called. Stamp something or other?
Tampering.
Yes, that one. Something like that might be able to, register individual items onto the Bitcoin Cash blockchain periodically for the cost of a few pennies. But if you're going to do that, why not use Dogecoin? I mean, really, if you're gonna be writing stuff into a limited store like that, where you only have 32 bytes per transaction, your cost is going to be better controlled by using Dogecoin. And I didn't catch your episode with Stampery, but I'm going to now go back over your episodes and watch and see if I can figure out which one they were at and figure out what they're doing. I can't imagine a use for payment channels in that particular case, because unless you have to have some place to store whatever it is that you're storing. And I don't know what it is precisely that they're doing with it. But when it comes down to it, no matter if you're using Bitcoin or you're using Ethereum or you're using Ethereum Classic, what you're really talking about is not only my cost to insert the transaction, but what is the reliability and the immutability of that. 15 years down the road, let's say I have a company that's storing medical records, right? Now, you're not going to store a 50 megabyte MRI inside of any sort of smart contract or any sort of blockchain. But what you might do is put the MRI up on something like BitTorrent, right? Mm-hmm. And have it encrypted through a smart contract that generates some sort of key store, right?
Right.
And then registers there that the MRI has a hash of blah, 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 and you would store the hash of the data there or some other index so that that data could be retrieved at a later time. Actually, I don't know if Ethereum Classic actually uses Swarm or a Swarm-like mechanism, but I would go with Swarm or something similar to that, or IPFS, or God who knows.
Right.
But then I would use the blockchain as an index for that sort of operation. And the problem with payment channels is they're about payment. It's very hard to set up a payment channel. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not even really possible to set up a payment channel or a lightweight channel into a contract that has to do a thing, to write data into the blockchain or to change its internal state. If you have a stateless contract, it might be possible. But once you start having to distribute your state, you need that DAG, that directed acyclical graph, to be in sync across all nodes, so that any user of your system maintains the same internal state inside of the application. So if you've got a true distributed application, your data store, or at least your data index, is the blockchain.
Right.
And being able to update that index is vital. So the quicker you can get that done and the cheaper you can get that done, the better the app is going to be in general. And therefore, reducing the number of maximum calls that can be run in a single block is anathema to developing complex, non-trivial applications. And what Cycle is seeing is, and I see this too. Well, there's somebody who's pumping out 5 megabytes, 15 megabytes into a block with what appears to be trash transactions. Well, yeah, but it's his ETC he's spending, and he's basically giving it to the miner in exchange for that. And yeah, you're fully verifying right now everything, and you're not getting any sort of reward. But where you're saying, shrink that so that the miners aren't generating that, I'm saying, how about we try to introduce some sort of reward model for people to serve up the blocks?
A reward model to incentivize people to validate the entire blockchain and serve it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, maybe just for serving up the blocks, like for running. There are coins that do this already. They split out the mining and the validating. So you have validators that say this transaction is valid, and then you have a miner whose job is to organize that into blocks, right? And then you have other people who are serving up the individual blocks. And without restructuring Ethereum Classic too much, a simple change, there was, I think his Dexaran was proposing a Treasury model in order to fund development, right? So we modify that, and then we add some sort of tracker that allows people to say, okay, well, I served up X number of blocks that were stored. These were historical blocks, and I served them up. And so they could make a claim on some small fraction of that. And it doesn't have to be an enormous amount. If you can make $1 or $2 a day serving up actual blocks to people who want to validate, who want to walk the entire chain, who want to make sure that everything is there, and then you added a reward for people who find invalid blocks, reject them, and reorganize the chain. If those types of incentives are there, then you get decentralization because you have opposing interests.
Right. No, you brought that's a good general point that you're making. So we've all gotten used to the idea of rewarding miners for the work they do, but if there's additional goals, additional things that we can reward people for that would help us achieve the properties we want on the ETC system. Like you said, Dexaran had proposed a Treasury model, and IOHK I know has discussed that as well. And then we could also reward people for validation. Yes, no, that the idea of rewarding other things besides mining is certainly a big idea that warrants more discussion.
Right. And my point is that that's the correct way to encourage decentralization, period. The incorrect way is to shrink the maximum size that a block can be, or the maximum number of operations that can be done in order to validate a block. I mean, one of the stupidest things, honestly, that Ethereum did was in limiting the amount of gas that could be sent during the send transaction to another thing. I mean, that caused everybody to start having to restructure apps. And when you start shaking the foundations that people are building their applications on, you're causing people to rip up 6-9 months worth of work. We've got developers who are being paid $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 a year to work on these things. You're throwing out $500,000 of somebody's work because you have decided that some contract somewhere implemented some feature stupidly.
Right. So we have to be very careful before we tweak the gears of the system, because it affects a lot of people in lots of different ways. No,
right.
Yeah, that definitely.
Especially, I mean, there's this whole thing that Wall Street is pulling out of blockchain. And I think that that's actually, can I swear a little bit? I think that that's a bullshit statement. The money that was thrown in has not been burnt. It has not been wasted. But figuring out how blockchain fits in your larger enterprise strategy, that's what I do. And I can tell you from the clients that I talk to that all that they know about blockchain really is that it is the future of database technology. It is a trustless platform, right? And that requires decentralization. And so what they really want to do is they want to move the infrastructure that they've got on Amazon or that they've got on Oracle or whatever and try to reduce costs and consolidate around this magical thing we've sold them called blockchain. But they have 5-year development cycles. They have to make a decision about whether some app that's been 3 years in development can even be refactored, let alone if it should be refactored. And modified to fit in a blockchain world. And the whole blockchain thing has only existed for 10 years. People can't really wrap their head around it yet unless they've been involved for 4 or 5 years of that. And then you have technologies like Ethereum Classic, which is the original old school OG Ethereum, that say, hey, here's a new way of looking at it. And Ethereum Classic's promise over Ethereum is, and we're not going to change a bunch of crap on you halfway through your development cycle. And tell you how much just simply telling people, well, Ethereum hasn't made any major changes. Ethereum Classic hasn't made any major changes in a year and a half. On the outside to you, that looks like stagnation. To me, that's salvation. I can sell that. I can say, here's a product that felt it was okay a year and a half ago and hasn't made any breaking changes in, they didn't even allow the breaking change that their own original developer tried to insert. They're going to be here for you in 5 years, and you're not going to have to modify anything. So we can put up front $100,000 or $500,000 into developing this one application for you. And over the course of 5 to 7 years, you're going to save $5-10 million. And that's a sales point. So not rocking the boat, that's really important to me and to people like me who are trying to help these bigger businesses figure out what it is that they're going to do on the blockchain and bring these kinds of applications. And, I don't just work with financial services companies. Yes, that's the big thing. But, there's game companies. Wizards of the Coast is looking to bring Magic the Gathering, of all things, to the blockchain. And I think they've selected at this point Ethereum, and that they're, already in trial phases and whatnot. I haven't kept up to date on it, but they're hardly the only card game out there. What if we could bring Nintendo and Pokemon to Ethereum Classic? Do you think that would be? I mean, that would be friggin' awesome, right?
Right.
But we're not going to be able to do that if we tell them, okay, well, you're going to have to convince a bunch of 9-year-olds to, you're going to have to convince a bunch of 9-year-olds to pay $1 every time they want to trade, and that fee might range anywhere from a half a cent to $3 to $5. You're going to have to absorb those extra costs and find a way to make that work. That doesn't work as well. But if you say, hey, we've got a ton of space here, CryptoKitties, if it had been done on Ethereum Classic, it wouldn't have choked the blockchain.
That's a good point.
To me, is a huge selling point. And then what the heck was that stupid exchange that had everybody bidding up 100 gigawatt gas in order to try and vote up their coin to trade on the exchange? I don't know if you remember that or not, if you were following it.
No, I'm not aware of what you're talking about.
I don't know. That completely locked for pretty much the entire duration, this project that we had, and ended up costing our client about $75,000 because they couldn't launch. They couldn't find any space on there. They're not going to pay $50 to have these transactions stored. So, had we been cognizant of what it would have required to go to Ethereum Classic, we would have gone to Ethereum Classic. But now I'm looking at Ethereum Classic, especially now that they've had that big shakeup in development management.
Yes.
I'm looking at that really as an opportunity to say, hey, look, they've got a solid dev team now. The code has been stable for years. Here's a platform you can build on. And just
to be clear, they had a solid dev team before and after the whole recent friction. It's just that the funding is coming from different place now. ETC Labs versus ETC Dev.
Okay, yeah, don't read me wrong here.
Okay.
When ETC first came to our attention, and I keep forgetting not everybody sees everything that I do, but it was really a news article that ETC had been hacked. That literally crossed my desk. ETC had been hacked, and really what had happened is somebody had changed the keys on GitHub. You remember that?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the My Classic Ether, My Classic Ether wallet. There was a website that had an ETC wallet. Yes, I know all about that. And the DNS aspect of it got hacked, and so people lost some money. So it had nothing to do with the ETC blockchain per se. It was just a specific wallet, web wallet.
No. I'm actually talking about something completely different.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Dev split. And look, I didn't follow ETC after the fork.
Okay.
I split from Ethereum. We had so much invested in Ethereum that I just followed on with whatever Vitalik was doing. But what I'm talking about is I got a news report that there was some big blow up on Twitter that was saying, do not trust the official Ethereum repository. It's been hacked. And the explanation was that somebody had sponsored a core dev team, and then that core dev had ended up locking everybody else out of Ethereum.
Oh yeah, no, I know. You're talking about recent events. Yes, where what the digital financial group.
Yeah, that one.
They tried to hijack a GitHub repository, but everybody just calmly copied the code to a different GitHub repo, and life went on as before. So Bingo. It wasn't as dramatic and explosive as it might have initially sounded.
I know, but you have to understand that when that's the first time that Ethereum Classic had literally crossed my view.
Yes, no, it wasn't from a PR perspective. It wasn't the best thing that could have happened to ETC.
It was not the best thing that it could happen, but what it did show was that the users give a crap about things that are really important. That there wasn't going to be the kind of blow up that I don't know how well you know Bitcoin history, but the current Bitcoin dev team actually ended up blocking out original Bitcoin devs. Rejecting keys and pulling all kinds of crap prior to the Bitcoin Cash fork. Okay. So before there was a Bitcoin Cash, there was an argument that really started with the guy who Satoshi Nakamoto himself appointed and said, I want you to lead development forward. And then Adam, I believe his name is Black, who happened to own a company that had hired a lot of the core dev team and started making changes that really didn't make a lot of sense. That basically got rid of some of the immutability aspects inside of Bitcoin and started making some kind of nasty changes. And so there was actually a big shakeup there.
Right. And
when you're talking to a company that's evaluating a technology, the last thing that they want to hear is that middle management and the CEO are at each other's throats with pitchforks.
Right.
That there are developers who are playing games like locking each other out, revoking each other's keys and stuff like that. It doesn't look good.
No, yeah. You're touching now upon another vast topic, which is proper governance in blockchain systems. And now that's definitely an important topic that's not quite worked out perfectly to everyone's satisfaction. But yes, your point is well taken.
I get that. But there's also the whole there's no such thing as bad news type of thing. And so when the report first crossed my desk, I'm like, wait, Ethereum Classic, I remember that thing. And so I followed it. And what I saw was a community that gave a crap, honestly, that cared enough about the product to literally say, no. We are not going to let one company hijack our development process, lock out important key devs, and tell them that they can no longer contribute because we've got a new vision for it. Right. Okay, that's the single most dangerous thing that can happen to a distributed company. I call it the what was the word? Somebody once used it. The tyranny of the developer. Right? Mm-hmm. You've got the keys to GitHub, to the GitHub repository. You've got the keys to the kingdom. You can literally make any change you want. Vitalik proved this in 2016 when he forked the chain to begin with, and caused ETC to found. So what I really see here is a lot of people who have a beautiful coin, a beautiful system, and it's this vast untapped resource that I had been completely unaware of for 2 years. And I'm looking at this as, wow, this solves so many problems. You have great big beautiful blocks that we can cram enormous amounts of computation into. The hash rate and the miner rate isn't bad, and it's not fallen into just one or two, diehards that are just holding on. There's actually a pretty decent sized community going on here. And because there's a decent sized community, the life of the coin can be extended. And if we can just throw a couple of killer apps on here, we can bring some attention to the platform. And that looks really good for everybody. Looks good for us because we found an untapped resource. It's like walking in your backyard and suddenly realizing you struck oil. It looks good to our clients because, crap, your code base hasn't changed in 2 years hardly. And that means that we can develop around that. There's not sudden, huge, sweeping API changes that we're going to have to deal with midway through our development cycle. And if you do backport some of the changes that Ethereum has made, things like updating the EVM, they don't actually break anything, and they reduce costs. They don't increase them. So it just looks really, really good.
Yes. So you're saying that the one of the points you're making is the fundamentals of ETC are very good, and it's a sleeping giant. There's a lot of potential there.
Yeah. We actually have a couple of people on staff, and what they do is they try to predict what costs are going to be, and they have charts, and I don't know how they do their numerancy, but they tend to be pretty right. Like they predicted that Bitcoin would spike to 4,300 on or sometime between December 12th and December 21st of this year, and it actually did it. And they were predicting that in November when it was at 3,100 or something like that. I mean, these guys are pretty good at it, right? Uh-huh. And they're actually predicting $500 Ethereum Classic by the end of this year if certain things go right.
I see.
The name, for one thing, is perfect. It's beautiful. The development team seems solid. They seem on track. You have a governance process that actually works. The community was able to rescue the coin from a literal worst case type of scenario. It looks so beautiful, and it looks great.
Well, I certainly agree with you. Yes. Well, okay. So we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a very enlightening, positive discussion. Did we cover everything? Did you make all the points you wanted to make?
I think so. I think what you're going to see, though, is 2019 is going to be the year of the killer app for Ethereum Classic. Period, point blank. You're going to see this coin explode. So if you're not mining right now and you're not holding a lot, I would definitely pile up on this coin. Mm-hmm. If you're a programmer of any kind, you're tinkering with JavaScript, you like doing web design, anything like that, now is the time to start learning Solidity, especially Ethereum Classic's variant of it. And I've started actually on Reddit a little blog to try and help people that are coming over from Ethereum figure out how to backport stuff, because there's got to be more guys like me. I know there's a lot of people out there who are looking at Ethereum and they're saying, wow, this had so much potential and it's just going to fall apart. You look at their development roadmap, it's a bloody mess. But we can get out from under that and we can start moving our clients over to something like Ethereum Classic, which has proven stability, has all the technology of Ethereum and none of the headaches.
Right. Very good. Well put. Well, thank you, Steve, for spending this time with me. It's been very enlightening. It was nice to hear from a developer in the trenches dealing with companies that are considering and have considered ETC for their applications. It was all great stuff. So just thank you for sharing your insight and your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So I wish you well, and we'll definitely keep in touch, and maybe we can have you on a future show if you have any other ideas for us.
Well, I'd be delighted. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks again, Steve. Bye-bye.
Bye.